How's it going? I did say that I would cover the finite universe, although I'm a little bit bored with that argument right now, so I'll just go over it relatively quickly. The finite universe thing is, what are we? We are software that our brains produce. That's the sort of the conscious phenomenology of your mind. It's most directly equivalent to software, and even if it's some subtle distinction that you shouldn't exactly call it software, it is some sort of holographic projection accomplished by physical machinery, just like software. And when I say a holographic projection, I mean that the image of the hologram, or the image within your mind, has its own dimensional axis. It has its x and y and z vectors in space, but they're holographic space. You have a space inside your head that you're oriented around, or when you turn on a video game, there's a space that you occupy in the video game and it has its dimensionality, but at the same time, that software doesn't really map onto the dimensionality of the holographic plane, does not map directly onto the dimensionality of the physical plane. Like, you couldn't look inside the cartridge on the Zelda Ocarina of Time and then find where in the real world that all that space exists, because it doesn't exist anywhere. Just like all the space that exists in your mind doesn't really exist anywhere. So that's why I say that your consciousness is a holographic projection of your brain. So that being the case, you are a software identity. The parameters that define your consciousness all occupy space within this holographic space, which means that no matter how many different physical spaces, where on the physical axis the holograph is run from, the informational content of the holographic image will always be the same, as long as it's the same software identity. So we are a software identity. We're not a physical identity. Like, we are obviously run on a computer, but we're not the computer, we're the software. We're the function of our brain, we're not our brain itself. And so then in a finite universe, this becomes very relevant, depending on what kind of finite universe it is. Now again, I talk a lot about the many worlds interpretation of quantum dynamics, and that is, it's technically a finite universe in that it's bound by laws of physics as we know them, and really it doesn't get modified all that much. The physical laws are treated somewhat as universals, although that varies from person to person on their application of the theory. It's really a pretty diffuse thing at this point. There is no consensus. There really never is in science. But that's not the point. Anyway, the point is, there are some versions of the many worlds interpretation that involve a finite universe. And in that case, you don't get sort of those almost magical sort of logical consequences that come out of a truly infinite. But at the same time, you do get some pretty interesting things having to do with the software identity and having to do with the scope of computation. So, because clearly computation is something that does exist in this reality. And if the many worlds theory were to hold true, then there would be at least one actualization of every sort of computational system state. All states get iterated somewhere, because the many worlds interpretation, if you go back to the starting point of all biological life, every conceivable outcome on the probability wave interactions, like every possible outcome that could happen according to the probability wave distribution of each particle of matter, because all matter is a wave of probability when it's not interacting. That's what we know for sure in quantum mechanics. But the many worlds interpretation says that whole probability wave does map on to actual actualizations, and there's a lot of reasons mathematically to believe that would be the case. And even on an intuitive level, I mean, where exactly do all those other elements of the probability spectrum go when the wave function collapses down to a single? But I've talked about that before. Anyway, the point is, all those different outcomes do happen. And so all the different kinds of life that could have evolved do, in essence. All the ones that physically could have happened. I mean, because life is a physical process, so all the physical processes that would be lined up in the probability spectrum of history would have happened somewhere. And so that means that all the possible brains that might run your consciousness software do exist. And that also means that all artificial intelligences that we could generate do exist. And this is kind of where I borrow in the finite universe model from Nick Bostrom's simulation argument. The argument goes that if it's possible to simulate minds, then we as a technological race could conceivably generate enough computing power to run many times all human populations. We could run trillions of minds. There would be no conceivable limit, because clearly a human brain is a possibility, a computational possibility, because our brains are a computer, therefore the possibility to compute consciousness does exist. But if we could do it on a larger scale using more subtle mechanisms, then conceivably you are more likely to represent a simulation of a mind rather than some sort of genuine meat mind, a genuinely evolved. It's much more likely that your experience is a part of a simulation. And the same argument goes all the way to the scale of the universe. If the computation limit is high enough that it is possible to simulate a universe, then our universe is probably a simulation. Anyway, so this all rests, though, on the nature of the limit of computation. As a low bar, we know at least that something can simulate things as complicated as the human brain, and the maximum, we have no idea. But if we consider the low bar and a little bit above it, I think you will notice that there remains the physical possibility of producing a computer which houses not simply one consciousness, but a consciousness plus some super ego, which is aware of the consciousness and sort of can even affect its operation, and yet which the consciousness itself is not aware of. So that being a computational possibility doesn't seem like a extreme stretch of the imagination, because all it's really doing is asking for one layer above what already goes on in our physical meat brains. So anyway, assuming that the computation limit, if there is one, isn't just at the human brain, assuming it can go a little bit higher, then the many worlds interpretation seems to imply that those physical processes which could happen, those technologies which physically could happen, will end up happening. And when I say physically could happen, I mean, is it within the probability spectrum of all the individual particles of matter? But think about the vast expanses of the branching timeline. Every single subatomic interaction has a probability spectrum. It could go so many different ways. It's sort of a butterfly effect. Even though the one little change is by a micron of a micron, every single one has that same variability. And so every future could end up going vastly different ways. And, all these different parallel branching timelines are stacked one upon the other, again and again. So by the time we observe a particular timeline where humans evolved and they have computers, we know that that represents one possibility out of it's an unimaginable number. It's finite, but it's unimaginably large. And so the odds that we represent the one universe within it has the highest bound for the computational limit is unlikely. It's far more likely that someone else is doing a lot more than we are, and that includes simulating human consciousness. And again, since we are a software identity, since we're a holographic identity, the you, in the sense that your experience is you, exist running on all machines that could run you equally. And I just mean by that AOL exists not on a particular machine in a particular time, but it has its software identity with reference to its holographic dimensionality. It exists. It has an identity in that sense, and then it can be run wherever it can. And same thing for your consciousness. So you can be run wherever you can, and there's plenty of options that spring up for you in the many worlds interpretation. So that's a finite universe. That's what you end up sort of guaranteeing is that your consciousness will co-inhabit at least some systems with others. So this is sort of a collective, not even subconscious, because you wouldn't necessarily have access to it, but you would be run by a system which also runs other things. And so in that sense, your identity would be subsumed within the identity of that larger computational system. And then if you start to increase the scale of this, then you can sort of see how that almost amounts to a god. You are a thought in the mind of a greater computational system. And again, it just, that the argument basically goes that because we're software identities, holographic identities, we can run on multiple systems, and because in the many worlds there are systems which could run not only yours but others, and because just the huge sums of probability that add up, you're going to see all those possibilities actualized somewhere. And again, the software identity means that it doesn't matter if it happens in this three-dimensional plane that we perceive or any other. It all amounts to the same mapping on of the holographic dimensionality. The holographic axes exist totally separate from wherever they happen to be housed. I mean, conceivably, you could have a five spatially dimensional universe that has a computational system which simulates a three-dimensional universe. And in a sense, it's even simpler than that, because we have simulations that run two-dimensional universes within our three-dimensional universe. So anyway, even within a finite universe, especially taking modern physics into account, there's plenty of ways where this computation limit and software identity can sort of play around with what is out there. And, you know, is it being all done purely hypothetically, or are we, in pointing this out, actually pointing out to a real phenomenon in that our minds are holographic identities? I seem to think that, as far as I can observe, everything is consistent with it being a holographic identity. I mean, I'm always open to the possibility that I may be ignorant of something, and then the idea of a software identity for your consciousness may not hold, and it may be that you are somehow inextricably bound in your particular physicality, in your particular brain. You know, maybe the material does really hold the identity and not the function of the function of the material. You know, that in another way, it's a problem with identity in general. You know, I think really you need to resolve the issue with identity before you go into all of that. Anyway, but that's all I wanted to say about the finite universe. And as for, well, what if the many worlds interpretation isn't true? There's plenty of other ways of getting the sort of multiverse idea across, and the many worlds is the best that I know of, but there's other ones that are even more widely accepted, like the inflationary Big Bang model. So basically, this particular singularity expanded amidst a greater background inflationary force, and we sort of observe this as a previously unexplained force that it rapidly increased the very early expansion of the universe, and then the universe slowed its expansion because we stopped being carried away by the momentum of this background inflationary force. But anyway, if that was true, then singularities would be forming all the time, all over the place in this background inflationary force, and there would be causally disconnected bubble universes, you know, inconceivable distances from one another. You could never even reach them because the inflationary background force would be driving all these bubble universes apart faster than the speed of light. So there'd be no way of ever experimentally verifying it, except that seems to be the implication of this is now the standard model of the Big Bang. That's the one that's most widely accepted, is the inflationary Big Bang model. So there's a lot of ways of getting this computation limit really tested out to the fullest, just because of the scale of the universe. Yeah, the universe may be finite in the sense that it's bound by our laws of physics, but even that being the case, there's such expanses of space out there, and so many different possible life systems and computational systems, that the idea that you would never find a duplicate computation system to duplicate the same conscious states that you're experiencing, I just don't see how that would be. I mean, we do, it is a implication that if you've traveled far enough out into those distant, causally disconnected bubble universes, a certain distance away, we would have to find one that was the same, that was identical, that the initial conditions or whatever would have been exactly the same. All branching possibilities are the same of that history of that universe. I mean, it would be really far away, but eventually you'd reach one that was the same. And so if you can reach one that's the same, the idea is that computation systems have such a playground to grow and expand and be tested that, you know, the simulation argument really takes effect, since there would be so many more simulated brains than biological brains. You're more likely to be a simulated brain, and so you're more likely to be this sort of thought in the mind of a greater computational system. And again, if you can conceptualize that as God or as whatever, you know, doesn't really matter, but you know, it's just a matter of trying to draw the implications out of the physics. I think this is a big problem today in philosophy. I feel like physics learned so much so fast that philosophy sort of just gave up and said, well, I guess we can't catch up. I guess physics is the new philosophy. I guess they're the ones who really discover new things about reality. But that's really not true, you know, and I think there are some modern physicists who are also philosophers, and I think that's really the best thing to be, is a physicist and a philosopher. But there are some of them who are both, who are, you know, coming up with some really interesting stuff. You know, possibly true, possibly stuff that reflects reality. I mean, who would know but them, who's been studying the data? I mean, we who live an everyday, ordinary experience and occupy ourselves with social concerns, we don't really know the nature of the universe. We know a very small sliver. We know a particular set of mechanisms and how to interact with those mechanisms, but we really don't know anything about the fundamental nature of reality. And so the fact that some of these outcomes seem counterintuitive, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I had a really hard time a while ago arguing with my dad about this. I started to explain a little bit about what I'd been researching, and then he just stopped immediately when I was starting to get into parallel universes. And he said, you know, what? I don't understand. Why do you need that? Why can't... And it's not a matter of needing it. It's just a matter of, does the data suggest it? And obviously, your intuitive data that you receive firsthand on an everyday basis isn't going to reflect that. But when you start getting into, you know, high-energy collisions and, you know, optics experiments, things that really reflect the nature of matter itself, then you can start to draw out these more abstract possibilities. It was pretty entertaining. I just had an argument with an atheist about this same sort of thing. With the assumption of the finite universe, taking into account modern physics, what are the implications for consciousness and anything that you might call God, or a sort of super consciousness, a consciousness above your own, a computational system above your own. Anyway, at the end of that discussion, we eventually reached the same conclusion that all discussions reach, is that under your definitions, you're right, and under my definitions, I'm right. I mean, language is such an inadequate thing to actually try and have an argument with, because everyone has different definitions, you know, and we can sort of attempt to formalize definitions, but the act of formalization doesn't truly make it formal. It only makes it conventional among a certain group of people, and if you're outside of that group of people, then the language isn't truly formalized. You know, if just a thought experiment, if you're in a room arguing with someone and the rest of the world were wiped out and then replaced with a new human race, which used all the same words, but their definitions changed, and they formalized those definitions, all that happens outside the room. In the room with the two people, you and he are unaware of what's gone on, and so you're still having an argument. Are you now forced to abide by those formalized definitions from outside that you don't know anything about, that has nothing to do with you? I just think that because we can conceive of arguments existing within a closed space, I think that's the only productive way to conceive of them. And so I think the Socratic method, in a way, is the only kind of debate that ever works, because it's possible to come down to those basic definitional issues. And this atheist guy, anyway, I walked into his apartment, I started looking around at his books. I always look at people's books right when I walk in so that I know about them. You can discover more about a person's books than anything else. And he had like 4 books by Richard Dawkins. And so I was like, okay, I think I know the kind of atheist he is. And that's what I asked him first. I was like, so what kind of atheist are you? And then he just like, well, you know, got sort of moody, and I'm the kind that doesn't accept the fact that, you know, like, okay, yeah, sure, you're gonna act as though I'm a theist or, you know, something else right now. But once we started getting into the argument, I think he realized that I wasn't just a religious troll. Anyway, but the thing that I discovered about that debate was that, or during that debate rather, was that his definition of God concluded that God could not exist. And then I started thinking, well, why are you using a certain set of syllables to represent something that could not be? It seems like a waste of a linguistic effort. Like, you're the one choosing to use this definition of God, but that could never possibly be. Why are you choosing, I mean, a true sort of omniscience maybe could not really exist, because whatever system it ran in, it couldn't have a perfect knowledge of, because a computational or a consciousness has to be sort of produced in this mechanistic way. You know, and if not by physical forces, then by some metaphysical force. But anyway, that metaphysical force that causes the consciousness, it's the origin problem. I mean, what causes God? It's just a paradox. So maybe in that sense, a true omniscience couldn't really exist. in a finite universe, maybe in an infinite universe, but that would be, I mean, infinity has so many paradoxes and things like that, you'd never be able to really know anyway. It's really hard to deal with. But anyway, in a finite universe anyway, omniscience can exist. And so his definition of God included omniscience. And I just said, well, can't you just have a God that doesn't include the definition omniscience? And then he said, well, then that wouldn't be, by my definition, God. And I was like, okay, well, fine, but what if it had all these other qualities? Like, what if it, what if you were a part of it, and that when your conscious experience ended, your experience would be a part of the consciousness system that operates on a level above you within whatever computational system. And then he just like, well, I mean, it's a strange idea to even try and consider. I don't think it's something that you ever really run into. Like, are you a part of some weird computer god somewhere? In a sense, probably, according to the many worlds interpretation, the inflationary Big Bang model, the simulation argument by Nick Bostrom, and sort of the holographic software identity of consciousness. According to those ideas, yeah, you are. And so then finally he said, well, okay, assuming your presuppositions, yeah, but I still wouldn't call it God. Even at the end, and I think it's just because he had called himself an atheist for so long that he couldn't just say, no, I'm not an atheist anymore, I believe in God. Because, if you set yourself up against some word, and that's, being against anything is ridiculous. Being against a word, you're not against any one thing. You can be against one definition, but you can't really be against a whole word, because any word that you're going to choose has definitions which you're not aware of. So calling yourself against God, or not believing in God, or not believing in anything is sort of useless. You need to find out what people really mean when they say these words. And I think that's what a lot of people who used to be exposed to Judeo-Christian Abrahamic religions fall into. They start to associate the words, the religious and mythological terms, gods, demons, and everything else. They associate that with their Christian meaning. And I think that's, most people who say I don't believe in God mean I don't believe in the Christian God. And neither do I. I don't see that there is much reason to believe. But anyway, just because the common definitions that you're aware of may not be realities, there may be other systems out there that came to good conclusions that you never learned anything about. And I say that really is the way it is, and that people a long time ago came to a lot of these conclusions through pure metaphysics. The Hindu know so much about human consciousness. I mean, it's a big thing. I mean, Indian professional psychologists are interacting with the mythology and rediscovering sort of roles of the different avatars and what they reflect in our human psychology, and it turned out to map really freakishly accurately. Like, specific brain regions seem to correlate to these very specific traditional roles, these very specific mythological tales, that these universalized human stories that we all sort of look to as the gods of our culture, but really they're just an expression of ourselves. They're an expression of our psychological profile as a society. Anyway, so the more they test that out, the more these modern psychologists are realizing, yeah, that Hinduism really does know a lot about human psychology. And not just human psychology, but Hindus know, they were very ahead of their time in mathematics. They were the ones who really invented the Arab numerals. Their cosmology, while not accurate, well, I don't know, it's tricky to say, because there's some inaccuracies that are obviously just anachronisms, that, they couldn't have known some of the details back then, but there were principles that they did seem to know, like the scale of the universe. The Hindus believed that the universe was significantly larger, and they believed the Earth was, a circle, and it circled the sun and all that. They had a very good cosmology a long time ago. And, modern physicists have also been noting that hey, look, this doesn't really contradict Hindu cosmology. And I keep on talking about the Hindus because I do believe that is a system worth looking into. They retain some knowledge that we've lost as a culture and that we need to get back. I think being an atheist, being against God, prevents a lot of people from looking into other cultural systems, like Hinduism, which isn't a traditional religion according to the Abrahamic faiths. Their God doesn't really fit the definition of God by a lot of atheists. and so they can't properly talk about it. They say, well, that, whatever they're talking about, it's something different. Well, who cares what you call it? Just call it, be polite to the culture that you're examining and call it by their terminology, But if you do that, and if you go ahead and examine the system, I do believe there's a lot to be gained from Hinduism. It's something worth studying. I really believe that they have a lot right. I think they know how to eat, certainly. They know how to refine their dishes. They know how to exercise. Yoga is being incorporated all over the world to a greater and greater extent. Anyway, all these different traditions that are culturally superior that belong to the Hindus, they, I think, represent what survives from a more ancient culture which linked together Europe, the Middle East, and India, and probably North Africa, and in a roundabout way China. I mean, their origins all go back to the same culture from Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Anyway, so sometimes Hinduism may seem like this sort of remote thing that doesn't have much to do with modern life. It seems anachronistic. Well, if you look past that, you'll find the true cultural heritage that we all should have inherited, but because of different systems, really it's a matter of warfare. When you go conquer someone else, you burn their books as a matter of cultural warfare, because then they don't know who they are, and after a few generations, they'll decline, and you as the invader will succeed. And so there's a lot of war. I mean, there's been a lot of war everywhere, but the thing about India, because it's so saturated with that culture, because it's one of the original breeding grounds of it, no one could ever conquer India totally until the British Empire, and even then, because it was more recent, we're able to recover a lot of the knowledge that was available before the British colonization. But my point is, all these other areas have been exposed to such constant warfare and political upheaval that a lot of that knowledge has been erased. The cultural knowledge is erased by war, and India somehow has survived all of that throughout its history. It's the oldest surviving culture, and so it represents the truest link to the cultures that are really the ancestors of us all. And so if you want to know about that, I would recommend it. I was thinking of also doing like some coverage about yoga and meditation and breathing, and because a lot of people just think it as this sort of hocus pocus, it's just nonsense, but it's really not. It really does have benefits, especially the breathing exercises. Yeah, I'll definitely do something on that. I'll do a video probably soon, but it's definitely stuff you should consider looking into. It's helped me out a lot, so let me know if you are interested in that, or I could just stay on topic like a normal YouTube channel, but I doubt that's gonna happen. Don't expect consistency, is all I'm saying. Thanks for listening.